Which of these stories will you be talking about tomorrow? Cheney unrepentant, Cheney unconscious.
In your view, we should still be using enhanced interrogation?
Yes.
No regrets?
No regrets.
Should we still be waterboarding terror suspects?
I would strongly support using it again if circumstances arose where we had a high-value detainee, and that was the only way we could get him to talk.
Cheney's autobiography. He wanted to bomb Syria 4 years ago. Felt better positioned to run the country on 9/11 than Bush. Trashes Powell, trying to get him fired. Trashes Tenet, says he quit when the going got tough. Trashes Rice, calls her naive and said she came to him once in tears and admits he was unconscious for weeks in 2010. He was only unconscious for weeks, and only in 2010? The Cheney memoir, They Call Me Dick. Romney on the run.
You had your turn. You had your turn, madam. Let me have mine. Let me have mine. Listen, I'll give you the microphone in a moment, but let me complete. I'm sorry, it's my turn. You had yours. Now it's my turn. Would you please hold on a moment? Let me finish.
He's not happy. Also, Perry versus homosexuality, he equates it to alcoholism, and Palin versus Rove.
But it is a sign of enormous thin skin that if we speculate about her, she gets upset.
And Cantor versus his own constituents. An earthquake epicentered in his own district. Hurricane Irene headed right for his own district, and he still won't support federal relief without budget cuts.
But we've had discussions about these things before, and those monies will be offset with appropriate savings or cost cutting elsewhere.
And Muammar Gaddafi, the fashion plate. Gaddafi, the Condoleezza Rice stalker, found in his compound 2 Condi Rice photo albums and a poem in free verse. I support my darling black African woman I admire, and I'm very proud of the way she leans back and gives orders to the Arab leaders. Lisa, 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 I love her very much. I thought it was pronounced Liza Minnelli. Who knew? With Michael Musto. All that and more now on Countdown.
Come to the cabaret.
Good evening from New York. This is Thursday, August 25th, 439 days until the 2012 presidential election. And you thought you wouldn't have Dick Cheney to kick around anymore. Instead, parts of the 46th vice president's memoir, In My Time, are leaking left and right. His first TV interview is everywhere, and thus it becomes our time to vet Cheney's sometimes seemingly delusional history of his 2 terms with George W. Bush. The 5th story on the countdown, the former vice president throws truth and nearly everybody he worked with under the bus. John Dean will evaluate The Scorched Earth and Jeremy Scahill, the fractured fairy tale that is Cheney's version of events. Mr. Cheney must have high hopes for his memoir, proudly telling NBC News, there are going to be heads exploding all over Washington. And if there is one American politician who knows about that topic, it's Dick Cheney. Ask his quail-hunting pal, Harry Whittington. We start the metaphorical body count with his chief rival in W's administration, Secretary of State Colin Powell. Mr. Cheney said Powell tried to undermine Bush when he shared some of his private doubts about the conduct of the Iraq War. Quoting, it was as though Powell thought the proper way to express his views was by criticizing administration policy to people outside the government. I have a theory about what he's talking about there in a moment. Cheney admits he also pushed to get Powell outside the government, asking Bush to dump the Secretary of State after his 2004 re-election. Powell announced his resignation on November 15th of that year. Former CIA chief George Tenet also gets the Cheney treatment, the former VP blasting Tenet for having resigned in 2004. When the going got tough, an act he called unfair to the president. Former National Security Advisor and Colin Powell's successor, Condoleezza Rice, also gets Cheneyed, described as naive for trying to negotiate a nuclear weapons pact with North Korea. And Cheney gets personal with Condi over part of the White House misinformation campaign in the lead-up to the war in Iraq. Cheney writing that he disagreed with White House aides who thought an apology was owed the nation, if not the world, for the misleading claim that Iraq had acquired uranium ore for its non-existent nuclear program from the African nation of Niger, a claim that led to the trashing, as you know, of former Ambassador Joe Wilson and the outing, as you know, of his CIA agent wife Valerie Plame. According to Cheney, Rice ultimately became convinced he, Cheney, was right. In fact, so convinced, she came into my office, sat down in the chair next to my desk, and tearfully admitted I had been right. And while Cheney And while Cheney was perhaps the foremost defender of White House secrecy in the Bush administration, he does not mind violating a few secrets now that he's out of the White House, writing that Bush came to him on numerous occasions for advice and detailing their disagreement on whether or not to strike at Saddam Hussein at the war's start.
Do you think President Bush will feel betrayed that you've revealed these private conversations?
I don't know why I
moments?
should.
You don't think so?
No.
You have always said that you believe the president deserves to be able to trust the people around him.
Right.
By revealing these differences, you don't think you're betraying that trust?
No.
And Cheney sticks by a decision that will always stain the Bush administration and the country it led, the use of waterboarding, a form of torture illegal under both U.S. and international law, to interrogate supposed top terror suspects.
I would strongly support using it again if circumstances arose where we had a high-value detainee, and that was the only way we could get him to talk.
Thanks a lot, Dick. As I said, we'll vet this in two ways. First, the Cheney's new revised history of the second Bush administration with Jeremy Scahill, Countdown contributor and national security reporter for The Nation. He's in Milwaukee tonight. Jeremy, good evening.
Good evening, Keith.
The New York Times is also reporting on this, that Cheney says he was, and I'm going to read the word from the piece of paper so I know I'm not making a mistake, an outlier in the Bush administration who criticized other advisors who took what he considered the misguided course about national security. Was Cheney out of the Bush administration mainstream? I mean, wasn't he playing Bush like a $2 banjo for 8 years?
I mean, for all practical purposes, especially when it came to U.S. counterterrorism policy or war policy, Dick Cheney was the president of the United States, at least in the first term of President Bush. I mean, this was a guy who, along with Donald Rumsfeld, was micromanaging every aspect of the U.S. targeted assassination program, was responsible for a radical privatization of the war industry, primarily through Halliburton, the company that he headed throughout the 90s and then gave the keys to the kingdom when he then became vice president, and was at the center of pushing for the most outrageous, illegal torture tactics to be employed. But I do think it's telling that he considered himself an outlier. It just shows how extreme this man is, that some of those other wacky neocons in there probably also thought Cheney was a bit off of his rocker. But no, he was very much had his finger on the trigger, and that was very frightening, particularly for the first 4 years of the Bush administration.
Mr. Cheney also goes into the events of 9/11 per se and his conviction that he would have been much better placed and was much better placed to have spoken to the nation that day and led it that day, especially with the president traveling, than was President Bush, but he resisted the temptation to do this. Do you have a sense that this whole president is in charge, vice president is the backup premise eluded him throughout that 8 years?
Well, you know, I never thought I would hear myself say this, Keith, but I think in a way we have to be grateful that Bush was the president that day and not Dick Cheney, because I think it could have actually been a lot worse. And I say that as someone who's been to Iraq, Afghanistan, to many of these war zones. No, I mean, Dick Cheney was very much at the center of this, very much driving some of the worst policies of that era, and was just an aggressive lunatic when it came to, he had an obsession with killing people and corporal mutilation. He says that he's going to make heads explode in Washington. Well, he has a long track record of making heads explode around Iraq, Afghanistan, elsewhere.
How sad that that's absolutely literally true. You mentioned how it could have been worse if the roles actually had been officially reversed. The Times also reported that Cheney also says he was the only member of the Bush cabinet to support bombing a Syrian nuclear reactor in 2007, in June 2007, something that the Israeli Air Force wound up doing that September. And by the way, he seems to be shocked that he was the only member of the cabinet who thought this was a good idea. Is he correct to our knowledge? Is he simply trying to demonstrate that he was the most radical, maybe unhinged member of the Bush cabinet? What's the story behind the Syria and the proposal to bomb that plant?
Well, first of all, let's not forget that U.S. Special Operations Forces from the Joint Special Operations Command, which Dick Cheney had a very, very close relationship with General Stanley McChrystal, who ran JSOC through that term. They did actually go into Syria in an operation that was supported by Blackwater, a company very close to Dick Cheney. And Cheney clearly was pushing to expand the domino pushing down of all these countries in that region. They wanted to redraw the maps. And the sort of elephant in the room here is Iran. Dick Cheney was a big league supporter of also bombing Iran. And I think that the Syria case is probably mild in comparison to what he was saying behind closed doors about what he wanted to do with Iran and taking out not only its nuclear facilities, but trying to impact regime change there as well.
And of course, we can't go without talking about the use of waterboarding. Has Mr. Cheney not an effect in this just by agreeing with the interviewer's use of the term? Hasn't he declared himself guilty of violating domestic law? Hasn't he declared himself guilty of violating international law and pretty much taken the rest of the Bush administration with him? I mean, it's not going to appear in a court anywhere likely, but at least in the court of public opinion, didn't he just damn them all to hell?
Right. I mean, well, you know, the fact is that Dick Cheney has been the big pit bull in going after President Obama and saying, you know, that Barack Hussein Obama is soft on terror and basically isn't keeping us safe. While at the same time, it's President Obama whose policy of looking forwards, not backwards, keeps Dick Cheney safe when he talks openly of having been involved with what I think many legal analysts would say was criminal activity in the form of torture, violations of not only U.S. law but international law. And I mean, I think we always have to come back to this, Keith. We can't forget what these people were responsible for, and I think it's one of the shameful aspects of this administration that they've taken a position that they're not going to hold those individuals accountable, including Dick Cheney.
Yep, it was a bad starting point, and unfortunately it's a good guide to the next group that wants to try the same thing. Jeremy Scahill, Countdown contributor, national security reporter for The Nation. As always, thanks for your time, Jeremy.
Thank you, Keith.